Imagine a teenage peasant girl, barely 13, standing barefoot in a muddy French field, claiming she had heard the voice of saints. In a country torn apart by war, famine, and English occupation, Joan of Arc's words sounded like madness, or a miracle. It was the early 1400s, and France was at its lowest point. The 100 Years' War had left villages burned, crops destroyed, and the French crown nearly powerless. The English had conquered huge parts of the country, including Paris, and supported a rival king who claimed the French throne. The rightful heir, Charles VII, was weak, hesitant, and hiding in a remote castle, too afraid to fight back. And then came Joan, a teenage girl from the small village of Domremy, who said that God himself had chosen her to save France. She claimed she had seen visions of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, commanding her to drive out the English and crown Charles as king. The idea was unthinkable. A farm girl, with no education, no noble blood, and no military training, was telling generals what to do. But Joan's courage, conviction, and charisma were impossible to ignore. At first, people laughed at her. Priests tried to test her, skeptics tried to trap her in lies, but she never wavered. Finally, Charles agreed to meet her. When Joan arrived at the royal court, she was dressed like a simple peasant, yet she walked straight through the crowd and knelt before the disguised king, instantly recognizing him despite never having seen him before. This moment stunned everyone. Whispers began to spread, maybe this girl truly was chosen by God. Charles, desperate for hope, gave her command of an army. What happened next would make Joan of Arc the most extraordinary figure of her time, and set her on a path that would end in betrayal, fire, and ashes. Once Charles VII placed his faith in Joan, everything changed. The timid, uncertain French court suddenly had a symbol, not a general, not a nobleman, but a teenage girl dressed in shining armor. Joan was given a suit of white armor, a sword said to have been found behind an altar in a church, and a banner painted with the image of Christ and fleur-de-lis. She didn't just fight, she inspired. Soldiers who had been demoralized for years now marched with new courage. They believed Joan was sent by God, and so did she. Her first and most famous mission was to lift the siege of Orleans. The English had surrounded the city for months, starving its people, and if Orleans fell, France's defeat would be almost certain. The commanders were hesitant to let Joan lead, but when she rode into battle, carrying her banner high, the soldiers followed. Eyewitnesses later said that she seemed untouchable. Arrows flew, cannonballs struck nearby, but Joan never flinched. When she was wounded by an arrow, she refused to leave the field. She returned with her wound hastily bandaged and inspired the troops to launch a final, desperate assault. Against all odds, the French won. Orleans was freed. For the first time in decades, France celebrated a victory. Joan's fame spread like wildfire. Peasants began calling her La Pucelle, the Maid, and they believed she was God's chosen savior. Her victories didn't stop at Orleans. She led Charles's army to a string of triumphs, clearing the path to Reims, where Charles was crowned King of France with Joan standing proudly beside him, her banner in hand. But this was not the end of Joan's mission, only the beginning. She wanted to keep fighting until every English soldier was driven out of France. Yet her growing influence frightened many, not just the English, but also French nobles who feared this teenage girl had too much power over their king. The very success that had made Joan a hero would soon make her a target. And the enemies closing in on her were not just on the battlefield, they were within her own camp. Joan's victories had made her the most celebrated figure in France, but they had also made her dangerous. Kings and nobles do not like sharing glory, and this young woman was becoming more famous than the king himself. Charles VII, the timid king whom Joan had crowned, started to pull back from her. His advisors whispered that Joan was too bold, too independent, too beloved by the common people. What if she decided to defy the crown? What if her voices told her to crown someone else? But Joan had no interest in politics, she wanted to fight. Even after Charles hesitated, she begged him to allow one last campaign against the English stronghold of Paris. This time, however, the king's support was lukewarm at best. Supplies were delayed, reinforcements were withheld, and Joan was left vulnerable. In May 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne, Joan led a small group of soldiers against a Burgundian force allied with the English. At first, she fought bravely as always, but the enemy's numbers overwhelmed her forces. As her troops retreated into the town, the drawbridge was raised, leaving Joan trapped outside. This was the moment her enemies had been waiting for. Joan was dragged from her horse and taken prisoner. The girl who had once commanded armies now found herself bound, mocked, and paraded as a trophy. But her capture was not simply a military victory, it was a political one. The Burgundians sold her to the English, who saw her as more than just an enemy soldier. To them, Joan was a dangerous symbol. If she could convince peasants and soldiers that God supported Charles, she could just as easily inspire rebellion again. The English wanted more than Joan's death. They wanted to destroy her reputation, to prove she was no holy savior but a fraud, a witch, a heretic. And so, the stage was set for one of the most infamous trials in history, a trial not for justice, but for vengeance. Joan of Arc was dragged in chains to the city of Rouen, where an English-backed church court awaited her. This was no ordinary trial. This was a performance meant to break her spirit and destroy her legacy. She was thrown into a dank, rat-infested cell, guarded by English soldiers who mocked and threatened her daily. For months, Joan faced interrogation after interrogation, surrounded by learned clerics and theologians who tried to trap her with their questions. They asked about her voices, were they angels or demons? They questioned her visions, were they from God or the devil? They even mocked her choice to wear men's clothing, twisting it into an accusation of sin. But Joan, the uneducated peasant girl, answered with a wisdom that shocked everyone. She refused to betray her voices, refused to deny her mission, and stood firm even when threatened with torture. Her faith never wavered. Her accusers grew desperate. They tried to scare her with threats of execution. They promised her mercy if she confessed. They forged documents, manipulated witnesses, and violated church law, but Joan refused to break. Then came the moment of greatest cruelty. Joan was taken to a scaffold where the instruments of execution were on display. She saw the stake where she would be burned alive. She saw the firewood stacked high. The message was clear: confess or die. Terrified and exhausted, Joan finally signed a confession, agreeing to stop wearing men's clothing and to say she had lied about her voices. For a brief moment, it seemed she had escaped death. But this mercy was an illusion. Days later, Joan was tricked again. Her guards deliberately left her with no women's clothing, forcing her to put on her old soldier's clothes to protect herself from assault. When the judges saw this, they declared her a relapsed heretic, a crime punishable by death. The verdict was sealed. Joan of Arc would burn. It was May 30th, 1431. Dawn broke cold and gray over Rouen. The prison bells tolled, and Joan knew her time had come. She had spent the night in prayer, her hands clasped so tightly they were bruised. When the guards came for her, Joan asked for one thing: a cross. A sympathetic English soldier broke 2 sticks and tied them together to make a crude wooden cross, which Joan held to her chest. She asked that a proper cross from a nearby church be brought so she could see it as she died. Her executioners tied her hands and feet and placed her on a cart. As the cart rolled through the streets, townspeople gathered. Some shouted curses, others wept openly. Even hardened soldiers were moved to silence. Many could not believe this teenage girl was about to be burned alive. At the marketplace, a massive wooden stake had been erected, surrounded by bundles of dry wood. The crowd fell silent as Joan was led up the platform. She asked for a priest and confessed her sins, weeping as she begged forgiveness, not for herself, but for those who had condemned her. Witnesses said she was calm, almost serene. Her greatest fear was not the fire, but dying without God's blessing. When the priest held the cross high before her, Joan fixed her gaze on it and never looked away. As the executioner lit the fire, Joan cried out her last words. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." The flames rose around her, and the smoke curled into the morning sky. Some in the crowd knelt and prayed. Others turned away, unable to watch. By the time the fire died down, there was nothing left of Joan but ashes, and the memory of her courage. Even her executioner was said to have been shaken, murmuring that he feared he had burned a holy woman. But Joan's death was not the end of her story, it was the beginning of her legend. The girl who had once freed a nation was gone, but the myth of the Maid of Orleans was only growing stronger. The English had burned Joan to silence her, but instead they had created a martyr. The morning after her execution, the marketplace in Rouen was eerily quiet. People who had jeered at her days earlier now whispered that they had witnessed the death of a saint. Even some of Joan's enemies seemed shaken. The executioner himself confessed that he was terrified for his soul. He claimed he had never seen such faith, even as the fire consumed her. The English had hoped that Joan's death would crush French morale, but the opposite happened. Soldiers began to fight with renewed passion, crying her name in battle. For them, Joan was no longer just a girl, she had become a holy symbol, proof that God was on France's side. Within 2 years of Joan's death, the tide of the war turned decisively. The French retook Paris, reclaimed their lands, and eventually drove the English out of nearly all of France. Charles VII, the same king Joan had risked everything to crown, now ruled a united kingdom. And yet, Charles did little to honor her in his lifetime. Perhaps he was haunted by guilt for abandoning her, or perhaps he feared the political backlash. It would be years before the church would revisit Joan's trial and recognize it for what it truly was, a sham. In 1456, a new investigation was opened. Witnesses testified about Joan's visions, her courage, and the corruption of her judges. The court overturned the verdict, declaring Joan innocent and her trial unjust. But for the people of France, Joan had been innocent all along. Her story spread far beyond her country, ballads were sung about her courage, and paintings were made of the girl who had led armies. The English had tried to destroy Joan's name. Instead, they had made her immortal. For centuries after her death, Joan of Arc's name refused to fade. In villages across France, people still prayed to her, sang songs of her victories, and spoke of the day she crowned Charles VII as if it had happened yesterday. But it wasn't until the 19th century that Joan's legend truly reached its peak. France, once again facing political turmoil and foreign threats, needed a symbol, and who better than the young girl who had saved the nation against impossible odds? Writers and historians rediscovered her story. Artists painted her kneeling in prayer, leading armies, facing her execution with dignity. Playwrights turned her life into theater. She became a figure not just of history, but of faith, patriotism, and defiance. The Catholic Church, which had once condemned her, slowly embraced her as a holy figure. In 1909, nearly 480 years after her death, Pope Pius X declared Joan blessed. In 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized her as a saint, Saint Joan of Arc. The same church that had branded her a heretic now called her one of its greatest martyrs. Her feast day was set for May 30th, the day she was burned. Today, statues of Joan stand in towns across France. She is the national heroine of her country, celebrated not just for her victories but for her courage to follow her convictions, even to death. Her transformation from condemned heretic to canonized saint is one of the most extraordinary reversals in history, proof that truth, though delayed, can outlive lies. But Joan's story is not just about religion or patriotism. It is about a young girl who dared to listen to her own voice when the world told her to stay silent, and changed the fate of a nation. Nearly 6 centuries have passed since Joan of Arc's ashes scattered in the wind, yet her fire still burns in the hearts of millions. She was only 19 when she died, a girl who never lived to see peace restored, never had a family of her own, never even saw her name cleared in her lifetime. And yet, she shaped the destiny of a nation. Her life forces us to ask a haunting question: what gives someone the courage to stand alone against kings, soldiers, and priests, and refuse to bend? Was it truly divine voices guiding her, or simply an unshakable belief that her mission was just? Joan's story is not only about war and politics, it is about faith, sacrifice, and the cost of following one's convictions. She was betrayed by the very king she fought for, condemned by the church that should have protected her, and murdered by those who feared her courage. And still, she never abandoned what she believed was right. When we remember Joan of Arc, we are reminded that the world has always tried to silence those who speak truth. But history has a way of vindicating them. Perhaps that is Joan's greatest legacy, not the battles she won, not the crown she placed on Charles's head, but the enduring proof that one person, no matter how young or powerless, can change the course of history. So the next time you hear her name, remember the girl who stood before her judges, staring into the flames, and whispered her last word, Jesus. Her voice was silenced that day, but her story still speaks.